Welcome to Order in the House, a review of the week's business in federal parliament.
Why don't you have the courage not to hide behind a public servant and get out there and front these ads yourself?
They want to channel everyone through the union movement so that the union bosses are the only arbiters of fairness in the workplace.
Prime Minister, did the Liberal Party, or did it not, run this advertisement during the party's 2004 election campaign? And does this advertisement say that the Liberal Party, if returned to office, would keep interest rates at record lows?
He can scour every transcript, and I'll make them available, Mr Speaker, every transcript of every interview that I gave during that election campaign, and he will find no such commitment.
The final session of Parliament before the election kicked off with the opposition attacking the government's workplace ad campaign.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question again is to the Prime Minister. I refer to the government's Barbara Bennett Work Choices advertisement on young workers that the government was forced to withdraw overnight. Will the Prime Minister inform the Parliament how much the production and broadcast of this advertisement has cost Australian taxpayers? Prime Minister, how can the government spend $37 million of taxpayers' money on IR ads when many working families are struggling to make ends meet?
The Honourable Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the Leader of the Opposition for his question. Those information ads, Mr Speaker, are very effective, and those information ads will continue. And the fact that they're being attacked by the Leader of the Opposition, the fact that they are being attacked by the ACTU, the fact that they are being attacked by the public sector union demonstrates just how effective they've been, Mr Speaker. I'm informed that to date the information campaign in relation to the fairness test has cost in the order of $23 million. Mr Speaker, there will be further expenditure. I don't disguise that. I make no apology for it. I think the provision of legitimate information on the fairness test is justified. And if we're talking about the use of government resources to run a political campaign, Mr Speaker, I also have in my possession a circular from Mary Kelleher, the Senior Director of the Human Resource Branch of Queensland Health. And the circular is dated the 11th of July 2007, and it has the heading "Your Rights at Work campaign." Now, this is on the letterhead of Queensland Health, Mr Speaker. It's not the union. What it has to say is the Queensland Council of Unions is coordinating the Your Rights at Work campaign on behalf of all unions. The aim of the campaign is to raise awareness about the impact of the federal industrial relations laws on all workers, including those in the state system, and the need to remove the laws by removing the current federal government, Mr Speaker. Now, this is Queensland Health. Now, presumably this is legitimate. Presumably this is an information campaign. It is directly political. There is nothing in the Barbara Bennett ads, Mr Speaker, that in any way attacks the Labor Party or in any way attacks the trade union movement or, in fact, provides other than factual information on the operation of our policies. In those circumstances, Mr Speaker, our expenditure is totally legitimate. The ads will continue.
I refer the Prime Minister to the following sentence in his recently published biography. One Cabinet Minister specifically recalled Andrews, that is Minister Andrews, explaining to Howard and the rest of the Cabinet that there was no getting around some workers losing out under the proposed legislation, the Work Choices legislation. Prime Minister, don't the losers include young Australians who can still be given an Australian workplace agreement which cuts award conditions like notice of a change of roster, which could change their start and finish times? Isn't it the case that the only thing parents can do about protecting their child from an AWA that allows changing hours and late finish times is to tell their child not to take the job?
The Honourable the Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, the particular allegation in the book is wrong, and I've made that clear, as has the former Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations. As to the other matters, let me point out to the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, yes, the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, that the workers, Mr Speaker, generally speaking, are better off under our policies than they were under the former policies, Mr Speaker.
Order.
There are more of them in jobs, strikes are lower, wages are higher, Mr Speaker, and the economy has benefited from the flexibility extended by these changes.
My attention has been drawn to the transcript of an interview on the ABC late on Friday night. Very interesting interview, I might say, late on Friday night. An interview with Cassie Whitehill. Cassie Whitehill said it was the last working day before Christmas, so it was a Friday. It was the day after our Christmas dinner, and I got a call to the office. I went with my friend, but my boss asked her to leave the premises while he spoke to me for 2 minutes. I went into his office, he closed the door and said, "I'm terminating your employment." I said, "Why?" He said, "I don't have to give you a reason. Don't try and back me into a corner." I said, "What are the reasons?" He said, "I'm not telling you why, that's just the way it is." He said, "I want you to resign on the spot." "I'm not going to resign," said Cassie. He said, "I want you to sign a deed of release to say you won't badmouth us or sue us or anything." I said, "I'm not signing anything." And then he went on to offer a week's pay, and she said, "I'm not signing." Mr Speaker, what sort of boss would treat an employee like that, Mr Speaker? And the boss might not be the Lilac City Motor, and we remember what the Deputy Leader of the Opposition did to them, or a painter on a government ad or something, Mr Speaker. Who was this boss who sacked this employee, wouldn't give her reasons, Mr Speaker? It was the Secretary of the Australian Services Union. Secretary of the Australian Services Union. And you know what, Mr Speaker? That man, Sean Kelly, is the President of the Labor Party, Mr Speaker. The President of the Labor Party, Mr Speaker. So Cassie in Tasmania, Mr Speaker, President of the Labor Party in Tasmania goes and sacks an employee, gives no reason, tells her to get a friend out of the office, so there is no record, Mr Speaker.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and my question goes to the Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations. And I refer the Minister to his statement today that the Workplace Ombudsman would investigate allegations made by a young worker, Mr Gebbett, that he was underpaid—
The member for Mackellar.
I'll start again, thank you, Mr Speaker. I refer the Minister to his statement today that the Workplace Ombudsman will investigate allegations made by a young worker, Mr Gebbett, that he was underpaid by an actor in the government's Work Choices ad about young people. Is the Minister aware of new allegations made by another worker, Mr Graham, about the same actor in the government's Work Choices ads? Is the Minister aware of the matters raised by Mr Graham's father, which include, and I quote, "It would amount to filling the boys with alcohol and then not having the money to pay them for wages. This went on, not paying them the full amount of money for the hours worked that they should have been paid for. And that when the son went looking for— I am. And that when the son went looking for his underpayment, he was frightened. Minister, will you investigate these allegations through the Workplace Ombudsman about the actor in your Work Choices advertisements?
Order. The Honourable Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations.
Well, Mr Speaker, we'll investigate all allegations. We'll investigate all allegations, including Cassie, under state labour laws. State labour laws, where the unfair dismissal laws would apply to the union movement, Mr Speaker. So we're happy to investigate these matters, and we do it responsibly. When an allegation is made, be it about any individual, we will have the matter investigated. That's why we set up a workplace ombudsman. I might add, Mr Speaker, that the Labor Party's current policy— the Labor Party hasn't got any policy on anything. It hasn't got a defence policy, a health policy, an education policy, a trade policy, a tax policy. It hasn't got a small business policy. It hasn't got a climate change policy. hasn't got a finance policy, hasn't got any policy apart from a half-baked industrial relations, what they describe as policy framework, which says nothing about a workplace ombudsman. In fact, it says it's going to abolish the workplace ombudsman. So where would Cassie go to get help? Where would the children involved in these allegations go to get the matter thoroughly investigated? Well, the Labor Party has a policy to abolish the workplace ombudsman. You know why? Because they want to channel everyone through the union movement, so that the union bosses are the only arbiters of fairness in the workplace, Mr Speaker. The union bosses that only represent 15% of the private sector workforce.
What we've also seen in the period that this parliament has been in recess, and we continue to see on our TV screens, is this government's desperate attempt to try and convince Australians that its extreme work choices laws, which have hurt so many Australian families, are actually good for them. These advertisements, these work choices advertisements, are everywhere you go. They're at saturation coverage on TV. You can't turn on the TV to watch your favourite program without having these ads. You can't open up a newspaper without having these ads in your face. You can't sit in a bus shelter without having these ads beside you. Indeed, they're in local newspapers, so much in local newspapers that in one edition of my own local newspaper, 2 pages of the local newspaper on separate pages had these advertisements. Now, the audacity of the government when it comes to these ads not only runs to the blanket coverage, but it goes to the fact that the theme of them is know where you stand. Well, Minister, sitting at the table there, if you believe that people are entitled to know where they stand, then I'd like some challenges set for you in this MPI, because Australians are entitled to know where they stand when they're judging this government at the next election, which we all know in the ordinary cycle will be in October. So, Minister, when it comes to telling Australian voters where they stand, we want today the following simple questions answered, the things you've covered up to date, the things you've hidden from Australians. The ads aren't about helping people understand their rights and entitlements. It's all about the foundation stone for an advertising campaign. This pure and simple, disclosed in the pages of our newspapers as a product of the government's polling research, nothing else operative on the government's mind when it came to this campaign. And once again, really, Minister, you know that that can't be denied, that it was a product of the polling. And then third, of course, the content of the campaign, because it's entitled Know Where You Stand. Well, Minister, if Australians were going to know where they stood, wouldn't you make sure that you've got messages out there in your advertising like the following? The employee can still be offered a take it or leave it AWA as a condition of employment or promotion. Know where you stand, Minister. That's right, isn't it? An employee can still be sacked for no reason or any reason and not have an unfair dismissal remedy. Certainly true for people in businesses under 100. That's right, Minister. Tick that box. If an AWA is given to a young worker which cuts award conditions, and they still can, then the parents can do nothing about it except their child not to tell their child not to take the job. That's true, Minister, isn't it? Know where you stand. An employer can ask an employee to work on a public holiday, and the employee can't simply say no. They have to say why it's not reasonable for them to have the day off. Well, know where you stand, Minister. That's true as well. If every employee in a workplace wants a collective agreement, the employer can just refuse and employees have no say. Well, know where you stand, Minister. That's true as well. The so-called fairness test doesn't guarantee any compensation for employees losing important award entitlements like redundancy pay or rostering protections that help them balance work and family life. Well, know where you stand, Minister. That's true as well. The Workplace Authority hasn't made a dent in the pile of 55,000 agreements waiting to be assessed. Know where you stand. Also true. And even though an employee might get a so-called fact sheet about the so-called fairness test, if they signed an AWA that stripped them of penalty rates, rostering and overtime last year, then you would do nothing about that. Nothing about that. They're marooned.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition wants us to pull out factual ads so they can be substituted with not only ACTU ads, which are untrue and misleading and full of lies and innuendo, but also to be replaced by the Victorian Government ad or the Western Australian Government ad. State Labor governments that are using state taxpayers' money to run a campaign against the federal government on federal laws. And you know what? The states and the Labor Party are so full of hypocrites that they could recall the power from the Commonwealth at any time. They could revoke their referral of power on the Corporations Law to the Commonwealth, but they're cowards and hypocrites. And they're cowards and hypocrites because they're not prepared to tell the truth to the Australian people, not only about the laws as they stand, but significantly they're not prepared to tell the truth to the Australian people about their alternate policy. And Mr Speaker, we had a good look at the ACTU ads. Between January 2005 and June 2007, it's estimated that the ACTU has spent in excess of $15 million. $15 million creating fear and telling lies about the government's laws. And Mr Speaker, that's in addition to the over $3 million of production costs the ACTU has spent. They don't include the recent CFMEU campaign or the ETU advertisements on radio in Queensland, the old ETU, Dean Mile, Kissy Kissy. Mr Speaker, the Deputy Leader of the Opposition's good friend, Mr Speaker, and the Victorian Advocate recently admitted to spending $1.3 million on advertising, and the Western Australian Minister for Industrial Relations wouldn't in any way, Mr Speaker, disclose how much the Western Australian government is spending. Imagine this, just before a state election, imagine if the federal government funded ads telling people it's okay to drink and drive in Western Australia, or it's okay to do 80 in a 60 zone in Victoria. That's what the state governments are doing with federal laws, our workplace relations laws. They're telling people that you can get away with what is unlawful activity. Now, Mr Speaker, if we were advertising in Victoria before a Victorian election saying it's okay to do 80 in a 60 zone, or in Western Australia it's okay to drink as much as you want and get on the road, the Western Australian government would be rightly outraged, and the Victorian government would be rightly outraged. Well, I tell you what, that's what the state Labor governments, who are accruing $70 billion of debt, are spending their current taxpayers' money on. Running ads against the federal government on laws that they can claw back at any time in order to run a fair campaign that creates uncertainty in the community. And when we go to correct the facts, the hypocrites in the Labor Party tell us to stop.
Minister, if you're so proud of these ads, if you are so convinced you're right, so absolutely sure about the right, why don't you front these ads yourself? Why don't you have the courage not to hide behind a public servant and get out there and front these ads yourself? Because you're no more believable than you were in this chamber today. And that's what you're worried about. Not willing to be the front person for his own ads, the minister perhaps is concerned that people see him as too untrustworthy. The government is using a senior public servant to spruik its lines. Secondly, it has also been exposed this week that it's not the need to spread information about the new laws or a desire to ensure that people actually know what their rights are under this legislation, limited as they are, but internal Liberal Party polling that has driven them to put these ads together. They are clearly party political ads based on party political polling. Today we've seen a third issue raised with these ads, accusations, and I note that at this stage they are just that one of the actors in the ads is trying to convince parents that Work Choices doesn't make young people vulnerable to exploitation, has been accused of underpaying young workers. I understand that the government has rapidly pulled this ad from circulation, and so it should. But what about the other ads? This pulled ad is frankly no less or more dishonest than the rest of them. What I'd like to see are ads that never quite made it onto the cutting room floor. The one where the government tried to reassure a worker in a business employing less than 100 people that he really can't be sacked for operational reasons and that he still has rights to unfair dismissal. Where's that ad? Oh, that's right, WorkChoices does actually allow that, so oops, we better not actually have that ad out there. Where's the ad that says that if you earn over $75,000, it's unlawful for your employer to deliver you an AWA that trades off significant entitlements for no compensation or even compensation of $1? Where's that ad? Again, that's right. The WorkChoices legislation not only allows it, it encourages this to happen. That's not an ad the government wants to show. The current debacle with these ads goes beyond the blatant waste of taxpayers' funds. We now see the government has hired someone who is alleged to have unpaid a young worker. The government urgently needs to review this situation and determine whether it still believes that this person is an appropriate pin-up boy for its WorkChoices legislation. Although perhaps when you think about it, perhaps he is exactly the perfect pin-up boy for this advertising campaign, accused of engaging in exactly the sort of activities the government was warned about that would happen when it first introduced this legislation.
While Labor was annoyed at the government's haste in pushing through its Northern Territory intervention bills, it pledged bipartisan support. The minor parties took a tougher line.
Today is a momentous occasion. Today is an occasion where the nation stands up and says that it will, as a nation, not as a government, but as a nation, will answer the call for Aboriginal children in the Territory. That there will be those that will disagree with the elements that are in these bills, but they cannot doubt our sincerity to act, to back our words up with deeds, with not just legislative instruments, with cash, but with people and real commitment. The children of the Northern Territory deserve nothing less than this size of intervention. This dramatic intervention will in fact help them in the way that is necessary. Any Australian that has the misfortune to be in the place of those children or to actually know about their circumstances firsthand could do nothing less than say that this must be done. We as a nation have to take this opportunity to remove this blight from Australian society. That is what it is. For too long we have tried, all sides of government, all ministers, for many, many years to do something about it in traditional forms and traditional ways, in the normal way that we attack these problems, and it just hasn't worked. We have to accept that it hasn't worked. We have to accept that if we have failed those children. And every day we delay, we can be sure that more children will, as a result of our delay, be hurt. That is a sad statement of fact. The fact that we now have people in Western Australia requiring us to do the same thing in the Kimberley shows that this does not finish at the Northern Territory borders, and I hope that the leadership that the Howard government has shown here, the commitment that we have presented in the form of these bills, this financial commitment, shows that to all of our state colleagues that they too should take this issue equally as seriously, make it their #1 priority, and in doing so ensure that Australian kids, regardless of their cultural background, regardless of the colour of their skin, regardless of where they live, actually have a future. You don't have a future if you are fearful every night of your life, if your fear is turned into the horror of child sexual abuse. That is the lives that they live. It should stop.
6 weeks ago, when the Prime Minister and the Minister for Indigenous Affairs announced the details of a federal response to help stop child abuse in the Northern Territory Indigenous communities, Labor gave our in-principle bipartisan support. Our in-principle support was given because the chronicle of abuse that Pat Anderson and Rex Wild detailed in their report into the protection of Aboriginal children from sexual abuse in the Northern Territory compelled action, as did the litany of reports that preceded Little Children Are Sacred. But to lament that action should have been taken sooner does not lessen the imperative to act now. Nor is the reality that child abuse occurs in all communities reason to sit on our hands in the face of this report. Our in-principle support 6 weeks ago was given in good faith. We were told by the government that they would bring forward practical measures, both a short-term response and long-term solutions, to end the cycle of abuse. For some, that article of faith was hard to accept, given the government's previous track record. and the manner and style with which the government began this intervention did not help allay these concerns, nor did some elements of the response package, which over a short period of time have changed significantly into the propositions we see before the House today. Throughout the last 6 weeks, Labor has articulated a simple test when assessing a government proposal. Will it improve the safety and security of our children in a practical way? We have applied that test, and on balance, the opposition will support these bills. There are elements of them we do not fully agree with, and I will be moving a few substantive amendments to reflect our concerns. I certainly hope that the Minister will recognise that those amendments are also offered in good faith.
On the Monday after the national emergency was announced, I rang the Minister's office and I said to the Minister's office, well, to the person in the Minister's office, after all an office really has no way to respond, but to the person in the Minister's office, his principal advisor on these matters, you need to understand there is legitimate concern in the community because of misinformation or misunderstandings or whatever it might be. There is genuine fear in some places that this is all about taking the kids away. And I later heard a story from a person at a community in the Barkly region of the Northern Territory, and recall that all of the communities which are affected by this legislation in my electorate of Lingiari, 40% of my electors are Indigenous people, all of them affected by this legislation. But that person, Barkly, said she was concerned. She was concerned because she thought the army was coming to take her young boys away so they'd fight in Iraq. Now, of course, that was absurd. But such was the misinformation and lack of communication which came out of this government as a result of the decision, after the decision was made, that people were left confused and dismayed. And I might say many are still confused and dismayed because they lack information. I go to the fact that a week ago I attended a Central Land Council meeting, a meeting of the Central Land Council in Hamilton Downs in the Northern Territory. 50 or 60 k's, well actually it wasn't Hamilton Downs, it was the property adjoining Hamilton Downs, the McCormack place. I listened to a presentation made by two members of the task force, the chair of the task force, Magistrate Sue Gordon, and General Chalmers. Now, what I found illuminating from that presentation was the lack of information they were able to provide. They couldn't answer so many basic questions. And the response from Magistrate Gordon at one stage was that we're working on the details as we go. Now, is it any wonder that people are left confused and dismayed and concerned because they don't know what is being proposed? And then we've had, yesterday, 600-odd pages of legislation. Well, if you include the appropriation legislation, probably closer to 700 pages of legislation. 350 or 400 pages of explanatory memoranda given to us in the opposition and to the general public at late morning. We got it, I think, at about 11 a.m. We are then supposed to digest all of that information, come up with an informed position, to then debate the legislation here this afternoon and have it out of this place later tonight. Well, I have to say that's an abuse of due process. And what that does do is show the contempt that this government has had for providing people, bringing people into the tent, sharing with them information and showing them exactly what they are proposing.
Now, the member for Lingiari quite rightly speaks for the people of the Northern Territory. He has a great deal of experience. Therefore, he cannot be excused for being ignorant as to the affairs that exist in the communities across the Northern Territory. And yet he takes to task the members of this government that have been responsible for the drawing up of legislation to address these issues. He takes them to task. He says that they ignore due process. Due process is ignored, and the member for Lingiari is concerned about due process. He says nothing about the fact that whilst one pontificates, whilst one spends weeks, months and possibly years, 13 in the case of the last Labor government, whilst members of this House, members of a previous government, drag their feet and talk about due process, the very tiny, the most vulnerable, the least able to defend themselves by definition in these communities are abused. They're abused physically, psychologically and sexually to the point where irreparable damage is done, and these children so often grow up to then involve themselves as adults in exactly the same sort of behaviour. It is not acceptable, and for a member of the opposition to stand in this place and talk about the abuse of due process when this government is endeavouring as quickly as possible to get legislation in place that just may save one more fragile individual from abuse, I believe is absolute hypocrisy. What is important is that we get this legislation in place, that we get it into all corners of all communities across the Northern Territory and start making a difference. Because mere dollars haven't made a difference. We put some $3.367 billion each year into Indigenous affairs across Australia, and still the whole system is riddled with problems of all sorts of dimensions. So money is not the answer. Resources, vision and tenacity. That's the combination that's going to make a difference in Indigenous communities.
I have never seen such an abrogation of the role of this Senate in the 11 years I've been here. And I don't think there's been such an abrogation of the proper role of this Senate and a override of that by the government or any government for many decades. This is complex legislation which is about not just the welfare and future well-being of the Northern Territory and the 40,000 Indigenous people affected in the Northern Territory, but about the nature of this country itself. We have yesterday seen Indigenous representatives from the Northern Territory in this parliament being hectored by a member of this Senate as they tried to present through the media to us their huge about this legislation. Let us make no mistake about this. There is a deep-seated feeling within Indigenous communities that while action is required to help where social parameters show the Indigenous community is in great need of assistance, that must come with consultation and with the assistance to the Indigenous community that this government has refused to give over the last 10 years. It's turned its back. The Howard government has turned its back on the Indigenous people of Australia over the last 10 years. And now we have 500 pages of legislation being brought in here, and the government says, and we won't, we'll suspend standing orders to ram it through the Senate. That's what's happening here. We'll suspend standing orders, we'll override it by dint of numbers. This is government by the executive. Parliament being sidelined on one of the most important issues because it goes to the core of what this nation is, this legislation, and how we relate to First Australians and whether we accord them the honour they should have. And that is equality as citizens. And the member opposite says disgraceful. I agree, it is a disgraceful process that's being undertaken here. And of course this legislation should be going to a committee. And of course that committee should be going to the Northern Territory to inform itself. This government says to the Indigenous people and indeed all the people of the Territory, come to Canberra on Friday or miss out. We're going to have a one-day sham of a committee system on Friday. Come here or you miss out.
We collectively as a parliament, as a political process, have ignored this problem and wider issues of concern to Indigenous people for decades, and certainly in the life of this government at federal level. And you cannot ignore an issue for 11 years and then suddenly say, yes, this is a crisis, it's so urgent that we now don't have time to listen to you about how we should do it properly. But that is in effect what is being attempted to be done here. Now, if we're genuine, and as I believe we all are, about wanting to be as effective as possible in assisting Aboriginal children in the Territory, Indigenous people in the Territory more broadly, and hopefully Indigenous people across the nation, then the least we can do is try to make sure that we do our job properly in figuring out how best to assist them. And in terms of the Senate's aspect of this job, that means looking at the legislation that is put before us. Now, if a case can be made that parts of that legislation are so urgent, so immediate to protect a child that is at immediate risk, then make that case. But don't just smear everybody who raises questions and saying you're holding the whole thing up and children will be at risk because you're just wanting to play politics or something. This is too important for politics for all of us, and I'd hope we could take that attitude in the course of the coming debate.
Yes, it is a cheap point to say, you know, that we've been in government for 11 years, why act now? I think we all know why we're acting now. It was the ineptness of the Northern Territory government, who had, until this legislation, the constitutional and legal responsibility to deal with these issues, and for whatever reason didn't. And all that I would invite people to do is have a look, and it's not often that I would praise the ABC, but the late-line performances by Chief Minister Claire Martin with Tony Jones showed absolutely everything that was wrong with the Northern Territory government's approach and its complete incapacity to deal with this urgent issue, even when confronted by the report co-authored by Rex Wild QC. She was then interviewed about that and what her response to it would be, and I can tell you it was one of those very few interviews of a Labor person where I was actually cringing in embarrassment for her. It was just an embarrassing, inept interview indicating that really she was not willing to deal with the issues.
Tuesday's decision by the Reserve Bank to put up interest rates gave Labor a powerful opportunity to question the Prime Minister's past promises.
My question is to the Prime Minister. I refer the Prime Minister to his party's 2004 promise, and I quote, to keep interest rates at record lows. What does the Prime Minister regret most, making the promise or breaking it?
The Honourable Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, the thing that I regret most is the impact that any interest rate rise will have on working families. That's the thing that I regret most. And if the Leader of the Opposition was interested in the human impact of these things rather than the politics, he might have addressed his question to the impact of these things on Australian families. Can I remind the Leader of the Opposition that the most definitive thing I said in the election campaign of 2004 was in answer to a question from Neil Mitchell. So you wouldn't be embarrassed to win the election and then to have an interest rate rise? Answer: well, I don't seek to give guarantees, judgments about individual movements. My argument is that they will always be lower under our policies, and that argument is supported by the last time Labor was in government and the impact of their industrial relations policies. Mr Speaker, can I just, for the benefit of the House and for a wider audience, repeat what I said in answer to this question? I regret very much the adverse impact of any interest rate rises on Australian home buyers. I regret that very much. I would, however, remind the Leader of the Opposition that when the current increase in the cash rate is passed through to housing loans, the level of the average housing loan in Australia at 8.3% will still be lower than it was at any time under the Hawke and Keating governments, Mr Speaker. At any time under the Hawke and Keating governments.
Order.
I would remind
the
Leader of the Opposition that interest rates for housing loans averaged 12.75% under the former government, and that is a full 4.5 percentage points higher than those interest rates will be as a result of today's increase in the cash rate. And notoriously, of course, they hit 17% in the late 1980s, Mr Speaker. I also remind the Leader of the Opposition that the industrial relations policy that he's handcuffed to, if implemented, will push up interest rates, Mr Speaker. That is the view of economists, it's the view of business organisation. It stands to reason that if you deregulate the labour market and re-establish a centralised wage-fixing system, you will create wages breakouts in areas of the economy that cannot afford to pay those higher wages, with adverse consequences for unemployment and for higher interest rates, Mr Speaker.
Prime Minister, did the Liberal Party, or did it not, run this advertisement during the party's 2004 election campaign? And does this advertisement say that the Liberal Party, if returned to office, would keep interest rates at record lows?
The Honourable the Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, the Liberal Party ran many advertisements, and I remind the Leader of the Opposition of what I've said in the House before, and he can scour every transcript, and I'll make them available, Mr Speaker, every transcript of every interview that I gave during that election campaign, and he will find no such commitment.
I refer to the Prime Minister's answer to my previous question when he said he'd made no such commitment. That is the commitment in thousands of Liberal Party advertisements in the last election campaign that, if re-elected, they would keep interest rates at record lows. Prime Minister, did you endorse this Liberal Party advertisement, or did you not?
The Honourable the Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I refer the Leader to my previous answer.
Given that the Prime Minister has today formally disowned the Liberal Party's ads on interest rates in the last election campaign, why should working families now believe any Liberal Party ads on interest rates in the upcoming election campaign?
The Honourable the Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I think the thing that working families should believe is what they experience under different governments. And I'm very happy that the Leader of the Opposition has asked me to talk about the experience of working families under different governments. And I'm very proud to contrast the experience of working families under this government with the experience of working families under the government which the Leader of the government of the party to which the Leader of the Opposition is formally committed, and that is the Australian Labor Party. We know, of course, what his secret desires about political affiliation may be, but he does formally belong to the Australian...
Order. The Prime Minister resume his seat. The Honourable the Manager of Opposition Business.
Mr. Speaker, on relevance, this is the third question about the government's advertising.
The member will resume his seat. The member will resume his seat. The Prime Minister has only just begun his answer. The Prime Minister is very much in order. I call the Honourable the Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I don't pretend to this House or to the Australian public that every working family in this country is enjoying to the full the very strong and prosperous economy we now have. There are some who are, through no fault of their own, missing out. But if you look at the proper measures that affect the living standards of Australian families, those measures do suggest that they have fared better under this government than they did under the previous Labor government, Mr Speaker. And not only that, but they will fare better through a continuation of this government than they would under a Rudd Labor government. I mean, that is what this debate is all about. It's all about whether working families were better off under Labor than they are now, or will be better off under Labor in the future than they are now, Mr Speaker.
My question again to the Prime Minister. Does the Prime Minister accept any responsibility whatsoever for 9 back-to-back interest rate hikes and their impact on family budgets, does the Prime Minister still maintain working families in Australia have never been better off?
The Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, let me say to the Leader of the Opposition that I accept total responsibility for things that happen under my watch and under the watch of my government. I accept responsibility. I accept responsibility for the good things as well as the bad things. And it is true, Mr Speaker, and I don't mind saying it to the Leader of the Opposition and through into the broader Australian community. It is true that there have been increases in interest rates, most recently today, and it is true that interest rates have moved up by 1.25% since the last election. It is also the case, Mr Speaker, that interest rates now on housing are still lower than they were at any time in 13 years of Labor.
My question is to the Prime Minister and refers to his claim that households with mortgages are better off now than under Labor. Is the Prime Minister aware official Reserve Bank figures show, even prior to the rise today, that the proportion of household disposable income consumed by mortgage interest repayments is 9.5% today compared to 6.1% in 1989. That is higher today than under Mr Keating. Prime Minister, are these figures accurate?
The Honourable Prime Minister.
I'm sorry, Mr Speaker. The figures that are constantly used by the opposition are those that include all mortgage liabilities and are not restricted to home buyers, and includes people who have borrowed money on their existing homes to buy a second property, and includes a lot of older people having paid off their homes, are remortgaging or repledging their homes under a pledge mortgage arrangement to enable their children to buy homes. If the Shadow Treasurer were a little in touch, Mr Speaker, a little more in touch with changed practices of homeowners in this country over the last 11 years, he would understand that he's not making a valid comparison.
The Honourable Member for Lilley.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer and relates to his claims about fiscal policy. Can the Treasurer confirm his own fiscal strategy includes a supplementary objective that says, and I quote, maintaining budget surpluses over the forward estimates while growth prospects are sound, unquote. Treasurer, why doesn't the government's own fiscal strategy pledge surpluses over the forward estimates no matter what?
The Honourable Treasurer.
Well, Mr Speaker, I am confused, and I'll tell you why I am confused. This is why I'm confused. The Labor Party asks me what our policy is, but the Labor Party supports it. So what is this? You're now asking me to define what your policy is as well? You think you should have asked me what my policy was before you stood up and said yours was identical, Mr Speaker? Now, let me tell you what my policy is and therefore explain to you what your policy ought to be, Mr Speaker. My policy is to produce surplus budgets. And as it turns out, we've produced 10 of them. And, Mr Speaker, if it hadn't been for the fact that when we were first elected and the budget was then $10 billion in deficit, we would have produced a few more. Mr Speaker, by producing surplus budgets, we have now been able to pay off $96 billion worth of debt. Now, I hold this out as a model because in the current circumstances in Australia, it shouldn't be hard. It was much harder in 1996 to balance the budget, but in the current period in Australia, with booming GST receipts, it shouldn't be hard to balance your budget. But what we're actually seeing in Australia is there are some levels of government that were in surplus that are now going the other way. And they are the Labor governments. They were in surplus, Mr Speaker. They were in surplus in 2005-2006. They have booming GST receipts. Some of these states have booming mining royalties. They ought to be able to pay for their infrastructure out of their revenue, and yet, Mr Speaker, they are going into debt. Now, why would that be? Mr Speaker, it's because they are Labor state governments.
Some 20 warnings from the Reserve Bank over a period of time, completely ignored by this government, completely ignored. And they've only had one strategy in place, that's to cut wages and working conditions. That's been their strategy, delivered by this minister across there, supported by that treasurer. Their only solution is to cut wages. Their only solution is to cut wages, not to lift the productive capacity of the Australian economy. And of course, we've had the warnings from the Secretary to the Treasury. The Secretary to the Treasury, on numerous occasions, but most particularly in March this year, warned the Treasurer about the government's addiction to short-term fixes and the need to involve the Treasury more broadly in lifting the productive capacity of this economy. And if I could quote the Secretary to the Treasury, he talked about a serious risk to inflation from policy interventions by the government unless it turns its focus to lifting our nation's productivity capacity. That was the damning judgment of the Secretary to the Treasury. He has little faith in this government, because what he was saying is in some ways reflective of what the Treasurer said to the Prime Minister's biographer, that this government will say anything, do anything and spend any amount of money to win an election.
Let's just look at the simple facts. The facts are these, whichever way you want to look at them. Interest rates when this government came into office were 10.5%. Labor left us interest rates of 10.5%. They are now, even after today, even if these rates are passed on, 8.3%, a full 2.2% lower than Labor left us. If you look at it another way, they are lower now than at any time during Labor's 13 years. At 8.3%, they are still 0.45% lower than at any time during Labor's 13 years. The promise that we would keep interest rates at record lows still stands.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question again is to the Prime Minister. And I again refer to his 2004 election promise to keep interest rates at record lows. Is the Prime Minister aware that barely 1 hour after the Prime Minister repudiated this election commitment in the House yesterday, the Chief Government Whip and member for Macquarie yesterday A, reaffirmed the 2004 election promise, and B, said that the promise to keep interest rates at record lows was, and I quote, still standing? Prime Minister, who's telling the truth, yourself or the member for Macquarie?
Order. The Prime Minister is not required. The Prime Minister is not required to comment on a colleague, but if the Prime Minister chooses the answer, I call the Prime Minister.
I have the member's remarks, but I did see them earlier today because somebody mentioned it to me, Mr Speaker. If you look at the context of it, the member for Macquarie has been misrepresented by the Leader of the Opposition. But Mr Speaker, let me just say to those who sit opposite, what I asked the Leader of the Opposition to have a look at everything I said in the last election campaign. It will enlighten him a great deal, Mr Speaker, what I said in the last election campaign, what the Treasurer said, and that is absolutely the truth, and that is that interest rates under a coalition government will always be lower than they are under a Labor government, Mr Speaker. Now, I would have thought that the Leader of the Opposition understands—
Order. The Prime Minister resume his seat. The Honourable Manager of Opposition Business on point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker. The Hansard from yesterday says the promise that we would keep interest rates at record lows still stands.
The member will come to his point of order.
I seek leave to table the
member
Hansard
resume The member resume his seat. If he wishes to table a document, he'll wait till the answer is completed. I call the Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, I would have thought the Leader of the Opposition understood that if you subtracted 8.3 from 12.75, you would be left with in excess of 4.5. And that is the difference between what interest rates will be for housing in Australia after the latest increase by the Reserve Bank and what they averaged under the former Labor government.
Does the Prime Minister agree with me that interest rates were too high?
Order. The member for Lily has a call.
That interest rates were too high when they reached 17% in 1989, just as interest rates were too high when they reached 22% in 1982, when the Prime Minister was Treasurer. Is this why the Treasurer has said, and I quote, "The Howard Treasurership was not a success in terms of interest rates and inflation"?
The Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I suppose on occasions I agree with the member for Lilley. I agree with the member for Lilley when he agrees with me in relation to my action over Queensland, Mr Speaker. I mean, the member for Lilley is a great follower, Mr Speaker. He belongs to that, to the school of economics, which seems to be, it's going to rival the Chicago school soon, Mr Speaker. We have the Chicago School of Economics, we have monetarism, we have Keynesianism, and we now have economics coming from those who sit opposite. But, Mr Speaker, there is something that the member for Lilley said this morning. There's something that the member for Lilley said this morning that I certainly didn't agree with, and that is he said that if Labor had won the last election, there wouldn't have been any interest rate rises. Yeah, I've got him there. If the Labor had won, can you imagine? I mean, what a fool I've been, Mr Speaker. All I have to do to stop interest rates going up ever in this country is to sign a piece of cardboard paper, which is what Mark Latham did in the last election campaign.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Has the Prime Minister seen the AAP report of 151 today entitled "People Better Able to Deal with Rate Rises Now"? Turnbull. Following his earlier comment that the impact of interest rate increases on working families shouldn't be over-dramatised, doesn't today's statement just demonstrate, yet again, how out of touch the member for Wentworth is and your government is?
Order. Order. The Prime Minister is not required to comment, but I'll call the Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I haven't seen that report, but I can assure you that the member for Lilley is wrong in saying that the member for Wentworth is out of touch. I've found the member for Wentworth in matters relating not only to economics but also to his own portfolio area to be very, very much in touch, and I think he knows a bit more about economics than you do.
Order. 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 The Minister for Employment. The Minister for Employment. The Honourable Member for Lilley on a...
The TGA bill...
I seek leave to table the comments, Mr Speaker.
Is leave granted? Leave is granted. The Honourable Prime Minister.
About the member for Wentworth, I mean, he has had some experience in putting into practice his economic beliefs. He has some acquaintance with the business community. He demonstrates a better understanding of economics than anybody who sits over there. And when the truth, Mr Speaker, is that those who sit opposite do not have an economic plan of their own for Australia's future, Mr Speaker. Those who sit opposite are either desperately trying to agree with the government and practising what I call economics. That reminds me, the member for Lilley reminds me a bit of my childhood. My parents used to take me to a place called Katoomba on the Blue Mountains in New South Wales. And the first spot we went to was Echo Point. You'd stand there at Echo Point and you'd look out to Mount Solitary and you'd call something out and the echo would come back. I mean, I'm reminded a bit of that in the parliament these days. You stand up here and you say budget surplus, and budget surplus comes back. Mr Speaker, you say rigorous monetary policy.
The Prime Minister resume his seat.
The one thing that's central to all of this message is that it's never his fault. Every time interest rates go up, it's never his fault. There is a new excuse every time. When interest rates are low, then all credit is due to the Prime Minister. Remember, the slogan was keeping interest rates at record lows, not helping to keep interest rates at record lows, or not chipping in to keep interest rates at record lows, or not influencing interest rates to stay at record lows, or not doing our bit. Not doing our bit to keep interest rates at record lows, or not even enabling the Reserve Bank to keep interest rates at record lows. No, they were going to do it all by themselves. The Howard government keeping interest rates at record lows. Isn't it incredible that when interest rates are low, it's all due to John Howard's good work. It's all due to the Prime Minister's good work. But when they go up, someone else is always to blame. Someone else is always to blame. Does anybody in the House remember the Prime Minister congratulating state governments in 2002 and 2003 for their good work in helping to keep interest rates down? I don't recall that. Yet apparently now when interest rates are going up, it's their actions that are causing the problem. Back a few years ago when they were low, no, the states clearly had nothing to do with it. 2 days ago, it's suddenly all the states' fault. They've got record low debt. They've all got AAA credit ratings. A couple of years ago, the Prime Minister was attacking them for not investing in infrastructure. Now they are investing in infrastructure. They're accused of putting interest rates up. And of course he's using misleading figures and was at it.
That's all from Order in the House this week. Both houses will sit again later today.